Smoak.
Great game coming up this weekend. Among the bangers in the top 25, Washington and Oregon and Pac-12. A good chance that somebody digs themselves in a pretty good spot for later on down the road with the championship game, but there are a lot bigger fish to fry. James Crepea from the Oregonian, good friend of ours, joins us on 365 Sports. James, I saw a stat where this is the first time in like 19 years that two teams 5-0 in the Pac-12 are meeting at this particular time. How much hype are you feeling in Eugene, or how much is there in Seattle?
Well, there's a pretty healthy amount, as you might imagine, yes, because, and look, this rivalry is probably the best on the West Coast, top to bottom, quite honestly, and will continue in that regard when it moves to the Big Ten, and for that matter, when Oregon and SC play, and Washington and SC play this season. That won't continue on an annual basis in the Big Ten, but it will continue in the Big Ten. But this is probably the biggest one on the West Coast, and it's been really significant for particularly the last 30, 35 years or so. And for the last 5 meetings, it's spanned 6 seasons, because in 2020 they didn't end up playing in what would have been a division title game at the time. It's had consequences. It's had significance, and it's gotten ratcheted up this last 5 years in particular, where this game has had significant meaning to what was division races. Now is just races for a spot in the conference title game, and with a conference that's obviously going away, and also national consequences. That even though yes, this is the first time with 5-0 apiece in that regard, and both in the top 10, so it takes it to the biggest in the rivalry's history. The national consequences were significant even in recent years, even if not for undefeated, because in that sense it was, well, if a Oregon, after losing the opener in 2019 to Auburn, or if a Washington losing the season opener to also Auburn in 2018, if either of them in their respective seasons were going to stay alive in any kind of playoff race, let alone conference championship races, division races, you had to win, that year in this game. And in 18, lo and behold, Oregon still ended up winning the regular season matchup in an overtime, and that was a great game. But Washington won the division and played for the conference title the following year. Oregon went up to Seattle, won the division, played for the conference championship, and upset Utah. So it's been a game that has picked up, and this and all the billing and all the hype this week is deserved. These two programs have put themselves in this position, and it didn't happen overnight. And it's a credit to, obviously, these two coaching staffs who are each in their second seasons, with two of the best quarterbacks in the country also in their second seasons with these programs, but fifth seasons in college football.
James, where does the rubber meet the road on this game, where it is hard for me, I've watched enough of both teams to have tried to break down where the weaknesses could be, but these I can't really find where it's going to be. It seems like two teams that are just loaded for bear, that are going to be ready to swing haymakers at each other.
Well, certainly you'd be hard pressed to come up with a weakness on either offense. They're both so prolific in any number of areas, and whatever even somewhat weakness Washington may have in its run game offensively, it's so abundant in its passing game, and probably has, top to bottom, the best receiving core in the Pac-12, and certainly one of the best in the country. And again, look at the production, and it's hard to argue. They're doing it. And Oregon's receiving core really loaded as well. Probably a little bit more of an edge in the run game, but you're really kind of nitpicking at that point on offense. Neither offensive line is allowed very much by way of anything in terms of pressure, negative plays, sacks, pass rush, anything in that regard. That's why they're 5-0. That's why they've blown out a lot of their opponents so far. Defensively, on paper, if you just look at the numbers, yeah, Oregon has the better defense. But if you delve into it a little further, giving credit where it is due, and contextualizing, again, caliber of competition that neither of them have played anything like what they're about to face this weekend against each other. But Oregon has certainly padded its stats against some inferior competition. Washington, when its best players are on the field, if you go inside the numbers, when the games have been competitive, usually pretty early, to be quite honest, but when it's been competitive, the defensive stats is, they're a lot better. So a lot of their defensive numbers that don't look so appealing on paper, when you just look in total, you have to contextualize that and say, yeah, but how much of that came in blowout games where the second or third team was in there? And the answer is a lot. So against each other, against the heightened competition in what will probably be a competitive game wire to wire, I'm certainly expecting it to be that way with two great quarterbacks and offenses in particular. The defenses, I think, is where you don't just point to where a weakness could be, but to where really the deciding factor is going to be, because how can you really say, well, one quarterback simply plays better than the other? Well, in order to do that, it's probably going to be a little bit on the opposing defense and who comes up with a stop or multiple stops or the takeaway or the big third down play or whatever it is, probably in the second half, either in a massive moment at home for Washington or in one of the most hostile environments Oregon could come up with, certainly on the road in Seattle.
James, how much do you think that Oregon looks at that Arizona tape and kind of sees how they were sitting back and, saw how Washington really had to work for yards? I mean, it still piled up numbers, but it was obviously a closer game. Is there anything to that, or is that just, 1 week that worked and it probably won't work the next time around?
Yeah, and it's one of those that, it's hard to necessarily, on two fronts, it's hard to know because I don't want to confuse what Arizona does defensively with what Oregon does defensively.
Sure.
They're really not very similar, to be quite honest with you, in terms of scheme and strategy and really top to bottom personnel. That said, yeah, you try to pick up on and see, with what little success opposing defenses have had against Washington so far, how do they go about doing it? I don't think Oregon's defense is built to just sit back the way that Arizona did, as much as it didn't do it exclusively. But I don't think they're really built and engineered that way. I don't think their strategy so far has been that way by any stretch. I think they're just playing more talented that allows them to do a few more things, either by rushing three, but really mainly rushing four. And yes, that they've dialed up a few more blitzes this season than they did a year ago. Not wildly so, not haphazardly, but they've been able to generate more pressure more consistently. Again, yes, against some inferior competition. I don't look past that at all. Because, look, an FCS opponent, Hawaii, Stanford, and Colorado, I mean, if you look at how many negative plays those teams have allowed, it's not good. So Oregon was one of many teams to do those things against those teams. So don't want to get too far off the handle in terms of, well, their defense is putting up all these kind of disruptive plays, so therefore they'll just be able to do it. I don't know about that. We have to see against a far better offensive line. But to your question, to your point, will they try to mimic some of the things Arizona may have done? I'm interested to see that myself. Less so in just merely dropping 8 or even dropping 7 at times, more so in some of the strategy of personnel. And like I say, it's hard to necessarily gauge that because, one, you just haven't seen an offense like this yet. And two, because if you ask a coach in the middle of the week, hey, by the way, in this massive game, you want to let us know about some strategy that you haven't shown on tape yet? But I am interested to see, because they're both coming off bye weeks, and they've both been in blowouts a lot. So how much have they been holding back for a game like this? Some things defensively on both sides that maybe you see a little bit more exotic by way of personnel. Maybe you see not just dime packages, 6 DBs, but is there a 7th or even 8th defensive back on the field in certain situations against two really prolific quarterbacks and passing offenses? Haven't seen that this season from Oregon. Haven't needed to see that from Oregon. You saw that in select spots from Arizona. That's the one part that I'm most interested to see from Oregon's defense in terms of personnel on Saturday.
James, the Dan Lanning, obviously, and what he's done there. Last year they got boat raced early by Georgia. I know they lost to Oregon State. No one ever wants to do that. Lost to Washington in a shootout at home. But how much street cred, if he needed that at all, did he get by the way he approached the week of Colorado and said he doesn't apologize for anything and just went straight into it, and how he handled that week?
Nationally, I'm sure there was some, because to this point in the season, that was the largest television audience for a college football game this season. So I'm sure nationally, yeah, absolutely. I don't know how much that week did anything to change anything on the ground here in Eugene, in the building, among the fan base, or anything of the like, because there was nothing that was really, I mean, go back to the summer and the whole, like, well, what have they done to affect this conference? And we're referring to when Colorado had left, and it was before Oregon and Washington left to go to Big Ten, right in between. That wasn't a shot at Deion Sanders. You know, everything from that game week became like unbelievable attempts to find slights in any which way, which was kind of ridiculous. It just wasn't. Now, yeah, the pregame speech, and they're rooted in substance, and they're fighting for clicks, we're fighting for wins. That speech, that gets on national TV, no doubt. From a national, when you have 10 million people watching, does that earn you something by way of reputation and get bounced around from television to social media and all the rest? Sure, no doubt about it. But like I say, on the local level, though, I think this fan base was already very much well behind Lanning and his staff, to where I'm not sure that. Bottom line, guys, if we go back throughout the entirety of the offseason, put Colorado's remarkable 3-0 start aside, and I take nothing away from it. He's done a tremendous job. What Deion and his staff and the players there have done so far, outstanding. But Oregon was expected to boat race Colorado all offseason. That was a team that came in at 3-0, who had completely overperformed in getting there, and credit to them. But that was a meeting of 3-0 teams where one team was supposed to be 3-0 and the other team was supposed to be 1-2, and the outcome was as if Colorado was 1-2. It was what it was. I didn't make more of it myself, and honestly, I don't think among the local fans and the local audience that was viewed as some unbelievable accomplishment. I think it was kept in a proper degree of context. And you saw after the game, Lanning's tone was far more like, hey, this is just one game. Let's not make this out to be more than what it was. He took kind of a very different approach and tone afterward. And I think one that spoke to what I'm getting at here is like 10 million people watched. They got to observe something. But I don't think it really swayed and moved the needle that much on the local level because it was already pretty extreme in that regard.
James, do you have any insight or just thoughts on the Oregon State, Washington State lawsuit with the Pac-12 and where I know their mediation has been agreed to or whatever, but where that kind of ends?
I am as curious as the next in terms of where it ends to that point. And part of the complexity of all of this isn't just the money. Let's not kid ourselves. The money's the driving factor. If there weren't so much at stake, and if there weren't existential crises facing Oregon State and Washington State, it would not be as severe. But it is. But part of the complexity of all of this is the money combined with real and true ambiguity in terms of what does happen under this scenario. In any number of things, in any number of factors. A lot of this stuff, blame whoever you want to blame. For those who are in the blame business, have at it. But the bottom line is a lot of this stuff is not written down in bylaws and spelled out in this level of specificity for this scenario. The bylaws talk about dissolving the league in the event of dissolution, what happens? Well, right now, to the moment, that hasn't happened. So what happens when 10 out of 12 entities leave and 2, for the moment, have not dissolved the league? What happens to the revenues? What happens to, not for nothing, the thing that we're all forgetting about, the liabilities? What happens to any number of things in that regard? In the short term, in the immediate. And that's why it's ending up in a courtroom. So to your question, do I have any insight as to exactly where it's going to go? No, I'm not. I'm not a lawyer. And if I were, I don't envy the lawyers who are connected to any number of the schools. And I totally understand the perspective of all the parties involved. If you're Oregon State and Washington State, you're going to do everything in your legal power to protect yourselves and your ability to get every last dollar you possibly can, facing the level of financial crisis that they're going to be facing. And if you're the 10 departing schools, you're going to be doing everything in your power collectively to say, hey, wait a minute, we're still in a league today. We didn't forego our ability to control and have say in what happens in the league we're still in today. And the argument is, yeah, but some of the decisions you may make today may affect not only y'all's future, but the future of those who haven't chose to leave just yet. And that's why, like I say, that's why it's ended up in a courtroom. And I don't pretend to have the answers. And the thing is I'm not sure that any number of the legal minds who are part of the process have the definitive answer, because it's always going to be shaped by whatever's best suiting them. And as I say, it's not laid out in the league's bylaws and contracts and any number of things. Some of these things are not spelled out in terms of what happens.
All right, James. Penix, Caleb, Nix, Cam Ward. It doesn't even include Cam Rising because he hasn't played. DJ Ugalele has played well. Separate them for me.
Shedeur,
my God. Sanders,
Shedeur,
Colorado.
Jaden Rashada, and Dante Moore. Yeah.
I mean, how do you separate? Can you imagine the first team, Williams, the defending or reigning Heisman winner, but try to put that together for some kind of postseason team, or who's going to get to New York City?
Yeah, and I think ultimately, certainly, whatever of the triad of Caleb, Penix, and Nix, whichever of the three has the most success in the head-to-head matchups, will certainly make it to New York. I would be mystified if one of them manages to go 2-0 and then particularly win a conference championship, potentially 3-0 against the others. There's no way that quarterback's not going. I mean, that would be truly mystifying for that to occur. I think right now, if entering this game, obviously this game will be one of several that has a huge say in the whole matter. I think that the winner of this one obviously puts themselves potentially in the outright driver's seat, if not certainly no less than second to Caleb Williams, if not on completely equal footing or ahead of for the time being. But I don't think, barring the loser having just a downright awful day where they're intercepted multiple times and it's a blowout somehow, I don't think the loser of this game will be completely disqualified from the equation. So I think there's a chance right now that all three of these quarterbacks could end up in New York, quite frankly. And as I say, I think maybe if there's a true divide between the teams by the end of it, where the two who managed to make it through to the Pac-12 championship game and whoever of the three of them is not represented there because of their individual performance, again, if they were intercepted several times in the two most critical games, or three for that matter, then I could see that quarterback being left out. But I think ultimately the quarterbacks of whichever two teams of the three most likely to end up in the Pac-12 championship game will probably both end up in New York. And quite frankly, whoever ends up winning the Pac-12 championship game will probably end up being the Heisman Trophy winner, in my opinion. I just think that the caliber of quarterback play in this league, as we've mentioned all offseason long, this was expected. Maybe not 80% completions for Bo Nix, maybe not similar, nearly 80% completion for Michael Penix in terms of on second down. On first down, he's, I believe, around 75, and then leading the country in passing yards. Maybe not every stat line, but in terms of overall performance, this is hardly a shock that these three quarterbacks and others in this league are playing really, really well. I think all three could make it. I think the two who play for the conference title game will make it, and I think the one who wins the whole thing will be the one who wins the league.
James, as always, great stuff. Enjoy covering what will be one hell of a game, we think, and we appreciate your time and hopefully have you on again down the road if Oregon keeps on doing what they're doing, and obviously with bigger games down the road too.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
You too. James Crepea, the Oregonian, Oregon, Washington.